It was a Friday night in late November, one of those nights where the cold seeps into your bones no matter how high you turn up the heat. My parents were out of town for the weekend, leaving me in charge of the house. I didn't mind. I was used to being on my own. Plus, it gave me an excuse to set up camp in the basement, where the biggest TV was. The basement had always creeped me out a little when I was a kid, something about the dim lighting and the weird echo. But as I got older, I learned to shrug it off. That night, I had a gaming session planned with a couple of friends online. We were deep into a match of Fortnite, and I was completely zoned in, headphones on, controller in hand. The basement was quiet except for the sounds of the game, and my friends' voices in my ears. That's when I heard it. A noise. It was faint at first, barely audible over the game, but it was there, a soft, irregular tapping sound coming from somewhere behind me. I paused the game for a second, pulling my headphones down around my neck. My first thought was that it might have been the old furnace kicking on. The thing was ancient and sometimes made weird noises. "Everything okay, dude?" one of my friends asked through the mic. "Yeah," I said, brushing it off. "Probably just the furnace." I went back to playing, but the noise didn't stop. In fact, it got louder. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was more deliberate, like something was moving. The tapping turned into a metallic scraping, like nails dragging against metal. I froze, my fingers hovering over the controller. I turned my head toward the source of the noise, the large metal air vent in the corner of the basement. It was one of those old-school vents, big enough that you could probably crawl through it if you really wanted to. The scraping sound was definitely coming from there. "Hello?" I called out, half-jokingly. I wasn't expecting an answer, of course. But I got one. A hand, pale, thin, and disturbingly long, shot out of the vent. My stomach dropped, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air outside. The hand wasn't just reaching, it was waving, like it was trying to get my attention. "Help me!" A voice rasped from the vent. It was low and gravelly, almost inhuman. I scrambled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table as I tried to put as much distance between me and the vent as possible. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The hand gripped the edge of the vent and started shaking it violently. The whole thing rattled, the screws holding it in place straining against the force. "Help me!" the voice repeated, louder this time. I don't remember making the decision to run, but suddenly I was upstairs, slamming the basement door shut and locking it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone as I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone in my house, I stammered. In the basement. They're trying to get out of the vent. The operator's voice was calm and steady, but I could tell she knew I was panicking. Stay where you are. Lock yourself in a room if you can. Officers are on their way. I did exactly what she said, running to my bedroom and locking the door. I grabbed a baseball bat from the corner of the room. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. That's when I heard it. The basement door slammed open with a deafening crash. Whoever, or whatever, it was had broken through the lock. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs, each one louder and more frantic than the last. "Where are you, boy?" a voice roared. It wasn't the same raspy voice from the vent. This one was deeper, angrier, and filled with pure rage. I pressed myself against the far wall of my bedroom, clutching the bat so tightly my knuckles turned white. The door shook as the person on the other side started pounding on it. "Come out! I know you're in there!" The door frame cracked, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he broke through. My mind raced, searching for a way out. The window. It was my only chance. I yanked it open and looked down. The drop wasn't too bad, maybe 10 feet into the bushes below. I tossed the bat out first, then climbed onto the windowsill. Just as the bedroom door gave way, I jumped. The landing was rough, but the adrenaline dulled the pain. I grabbed the bat and ran toward the street, hoping and praying the police would get there in time. As if on cue, flashing red and blue lights lit up the darkness. A police cruiser screeched to a stop, and 2 officers jumped out, guns drawn. I pointed toward the house, shouting incoherently about the man inside. The officers didn't hesitate. They rushed in, their voices commanding and firm. I stayed on the lawn, clutching the bat and trying to catch my breath. Minutes later, they dragged the man out in handcuffs. He was tall and wiry, his face gaunt and hollow. His eyes locked onto mine, filled with a hatred so intense it made my skin crawl. "You think this is over?" he hissed as the officers shoved him into the back of the cruiser. "You're dead, boy. You hear me? Dead." Even after they took him away, I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me. The police searched the house and found evidence that he'd been living in the crawl space under the basement for weeks, maybe longer. They never figured out how he got in, or why he was there. When I was a kid, my family lived in a small town in upstate New York. The house we rented was old, probably built in the 40s or 50s, with creaky wooden floors, faded wallpaper, and windows that didn't seal quite right. It was drafty in the winter and smelled like damp wood in the summer. I lived there with my parents and my older brother, Matt. I couldn't have been older than 8 or 9 at the time, and to me, the house seemed enormous and full of possibilities. Our favorite part of the house was the basement. It wasn't finished, but it was big, with low ceilings and a cement floor. Dad had put an old billiard table down there, along with a beat-up air hockey table and a TV hooked up to a Super Nintendo. Matt and I would spend hours down there, battling it out in games of Street Fighter or Mario Kart. It was our little haven. But looking back now, I can't deny there was something off about the basement. I can't explain it fully. Maybe it was the way the single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling never seemed bright enough, or the constant, faint smell of mildew that no amount of cleaning could erase. Whatever it was, Matt and I never liked being down there alone. It was unspoken, but understood between us. The basement was fine as long as there were 2 of us. Alone? No thanks. The first strange thing happened on a rainy Saturday afternoon. Matt and I were in the basement, huddled around the TV, taking turns playing Donkey Kong Country. It was just the 2 of us. Mom was upstairs cooking, and Dad was out running errands. The sound of the rain hitting the small basement windows made the space feel cozy, and we were totally engrossed in the game. Then, out of nowhere, we heard a loud bang. It came from the laundry room at the far end of the basement. The sound was sharp and sudden, like something heavy had slammed shut. Matt paused the game, and we both froze, staring at each other. "You heard that, right?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded. Slowly, we got up and walked toward the laundry room. The door was slightly ajar, and inside it was pitch black. The only light came from the glow of the paused TV screen behind us. Matt pushed the door open all the way. The room was empty, just like it always was. Washer, dryer, a few baskets of clothes. Everything looked normal, except the dryer door was now closed. We both distinctly remembered it being open earlier. Matt, trying to act brave, walked over and pulled the dryer door open. It was empty inside. No clothes, no signs of anything. "Must have been the wind or something," he said, but I could tell he didn't really believe it. Neither did I. The second time something happened, it was late at night, maybe a week later. I had gone to bed early, but around midnight, I woke up to the sound of muffled voices. It took me a moment to realize it was coming from the basement. The TV was on. At first, I thought it was Matt. Maybe he couldn't sleep and had gone down to play video games. But when I got up to check, his bedroom door was shut, and I could hear him snoring softly inside. The voices from the basement continued, low, indistinct, but definitely there. My heart started pounding. I ran to my parents' room and woke up Dad. He groggily followed me downstairs, muttering about how the TV had been acting up lately and probably turned itself on. When we got to the basement, the TV was indeed on, flickering with static. The remote was lying on the air hockey table, untouched. Dad turned it off and told me to go back to bed. "It's just a glitch," he said, but I could see the unease in his eyes. The last, and by far the worst, incident happened about a month later, just a few days before we moved out of that house. By then, the basement was mostly cleared out. The billiard table had been sold, the air hockey table was gone, and most of the boxes were packed and sitting in the garage. The only things left were the TV and the Super Nintendo, which Matt and I were still clinging to for entertainment. It was late afternoon, and we were in the basement playing Super Mario World. We were laughing and bickering like usual, trying to beat one of the harder levels, when something hit me. Hard. It felt like a sharp thud on the back of my head. Startled, I turned around and saw a red rubber ball bouncing across the cement floor. It came to a stop near the laundry room door, which was now slightly ajar. "Did you throw that?" I snapped at Matt, but he looked just as shocked as I felt. "No," he said quickly. "I didn't even see where it came from." We both stared at the ball for a long moment. Then, as if in slow motion, the laundry room door began to creak shut. Not fast, but slow and deliberate, until it clicked shut with a soft finality. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. Then Matt grabbed my arm and yanked me toward the stairs. "Come on!" he shouted, his voice panicked. We ran upstairs as fast as we could and slammed the door behind us. We told our parents what had happened, but when Dad went down to check, he couldn't get the laundry room door open. He tried pulling, pushing, even kicking it, but it wouldn't budge. Eventually, he gave up and said we'd deal with it later. That night, none of us slept. The next morning, Dad called a locksmith to come take a look at the door, but before they arrived, something even stranger happened. The door to the laundry room was wide open. Just like that. No signs of damage, no explanation. Dad didn't say much after that. In fact, he seemed unusually quiet for the rest of the time we lived there. A few days later, we moved out. Years later, when I was older, I brought it up to my mom. She didn't like talking about it. All she would say was that Dad had been really shaken by whatever happened in the basement that day, but he refused to discuss it. As for me, I don't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was a draft, or old wiring, or just our imaginations running wild. But no matter how hard I try, I can't explain that red ball, or the door, or the fear I felt in that basement. Some things, I guess, are better left unanswered. It was about 5 years ago, late at night, close to 11 p.m., if I recall correctly. I was driving home after spending the weekend at my friend's place in a small town about an hour away. The road I was on was desolate, stretching through miles of forest and empty fields. Not a soul in sight. The only light came from my car's aging headlights and the occasional glow of the moon breaking through the clouds. I'd been having issues with my car for a while. It was an old thing, practically a relic, but I couldn't afford a replacement. That night my luck ran out. As I was driving, the dashboard lights flickered, and the engine sputtered. Before I could even react, the car jerked to a stop. Dead. I sat there for a moment, stunned. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I tried turning the key in the ignition, but nothing happened. My phone? No service. Of course, out here, I wasn't surprised. After a few minutes of panicking and pacing around the car, I realized I had no choice but to figure something out. The nearest gas station was about 4 or 5 miles down the road. I remembered passing it earlier in the evening. Walking there in the dark didn't seem ideal, but what else could I do? As I was debating whether to stay in the car or start walking, I saw headlights approaching from a distance. Relief washed over me. I stepped into the road and waved, hoping whoever it was would stop. The car pulled over, a beat-up old station wagon that looked even worse than my car. The driver rolled down the window, and I saw a man in his mid-50s. He had thinning gray hair, a scruffy beard, and wore a flannel shirt with sleeves rolled up. "You all right there?" he asked, his voice gravelly. No. My car broke down, I said, pointing behind me. I think it's the alternator or something. No phone service either. He nodded slowly, as if taking it all in. That's rough. I can give you a ride to the gas station if you want. Ain't too far. I hesitated. Everything about the situation screamed stranger danger. But it was late, I was stranded, and walking alone through miles of darkness wasn't exactly a better option. Yeah, alright, I finally said, though my gut twisted as I climbed into the passenger seat. The inside of his car was just as rundown as the outside. It smelled like cigarettes and stale beer, with empty cans scattered on the floor. I buckled up, trying to act casual, but my hands were already clammy. For the first few minutes he didn't say much. Just kept his eyes on the road, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the gear shift. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. So, I said, trying to break the tension. You from around here? He glanced at me briefly. Lived here all my life. Know these roads like the back of my hand. I nodded, forcing a polite smile. He didn't seem interested in chatting, so I fell quiet again. 15 minutes passed, and I started to notice something odd. We should have reached the gas station by now, but we hadn't. In fact, we'd passed a small convenience store about 5 minutes earlier, and he didn't even slow down. Wasn't that a gas station back there? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Nah, he said shortly. That place ain't open this late. Don't worry, I know where we're going. My unease grew. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, hoping to at least look busy, but he glanced over and said, Ain't no point in that. No service out here. His tone was sharp, almost scolding. I quickly shoved the phone back into my pocket, my heart pounding. The road ahead was getting narrower, winding deeper into the woods. Trees loomed on either side, their shadows stretching across the pavement like skeletal hands. Where exactly are we headed? I asked, my voice trembling. Relax, he said, not looking at me. You'll see. I didn't like the way he said it. My fingers tightened around the door handle. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. Then, the car slowed as we approached a sharp curve. It wasn't much, but it was my chance. Without thinking, I yanked the door handle, pushed it open, and jumped. The impact was brutal. I hit the pavement hard, pain shooting through my shoulder and knees. The car screeched to a halt behind me, but I didn't look back. I scrambled to my feet and bolted into the woods. Branches slapped at my face and arms as I ran, adrenaline drowning out the pain. I didn't dare stop. I could hear him shouting behind me, his footsteps crashing through the underbrush. Eventually, I saw a faint light through the trees, a house. I sprinted toward it, nearly collapsing onto the porch as I banged on the door. Help! Please help me! I shouted, my voice cracking. The porch light flicked on, and a man's voice called out from inside. Who's there? Someone's after me. Please call the police. The door didn't open, but I heard the sound of a phone dialing. I'm calling them now. Stay put. I crouched by the door, trembling. A few minutes later, I heard sirens in the distance. The man from the car was nowhere to be seen. When the police arrived, I told them everything. They searched the area but didn't find him or his car. They called a tow truck for me, and I finally made it home hours later, shaken but alive. I bought a new car not long after and haven't taken a ride from a stranger since. To this day, I don't know what that man's intentions were, and I hope I never find out. I just pray he didn't find someone else that night. It all started as an ordinary day. I'd planned a solo road trip from my hometown in Ohio to visit a friend in New York. I left around noon, expecting a smooth 8-hour drive. My car, a trusty sedan that I'd owned for years, was in good condition. The weather was perfect, clear skies, just cool enough to make driving comfortable without blasting the air conditioning. I had snacks in the passenger seat, my playlist queued up, and everything seemed to be going as planned. By sunset, I was somewhere in Pennsylvania, cruising along a quiet stretch of highway. Traffic had thinned out considerably, and I started to enjoy the solitude. The hum of the tires on the asphalt and the golden light fading into the horizon were almost hypnotic. But then, around 9 p.m., just as darkness had fully set in, I noticed something strange. A black Jeep appeared in my rearview mirror. At first, it was nothing out of the ordinary. Cars come and go on highways. But this one caught my attention because of how closely it was tailing me. I slowed down slightly, hoping it would pass, but instead, it pulled up alongside me. I glanced over and saw the driver, a man wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, even though it was night. His face was turned toward me, and he was staring. No, more than staring, glaring, like he was trying to make some kind of point. He raised his hand and pointed at me, gesturing for me to pull over. I froze. What was this guy's problem? Was there something wrong with my car? I stayed in my lane, trying to ignore him. But he didn't give up. For the next mile or so, he kept pace with me, occasionally honking and flashing his high beams. My heart started to race. Maybe he was trying to warn me about something, but his behavior felt off. Finally, I saw a sign for a gas station a couple of miles ahead. I figured it wouldn't hurt to stop and check my car. Plus, I could put some distance between me and this guy. As I pulled into the gas station, the Jeep sped past, disappearing down the highway. I parked under the bright lights near the pump and got out to inspect my car. Everything seemed fine. No flat tires, no smoke, no strange noises. I even opened the hood and checked the oil, just to be thorough. The attendant inside gave me a weird look as I loitered around, pretending to clean my windshield just to kill time. I didn't want to get back on the road until I was sure the Jeep was gone. After about 10 minutes, I decided it was safe to continue. Back on the highway, I felt a little better. The Jeep was nowhere in sight, and the road was quiet again. But my relief was short-lived. Not even 15 minutes later, there it was. The same black Jeep, parked on the shoulder just ahead. As I approached, its headlights flicked on, and it pulled onto the road, merging into my lane. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. The Jeep caught up to me quickly, again driving parallel to my car. The man in the cap leaned toward his window, shouting something I couldn't hear. Then, to my horror, two more figures emerged from the back seat, their silhouettes barely visible through the tinted windows. They rolled their windows down, and one of them leaned out, motioning aggressively for me to pull over. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and stared straight ahead, pretending I hadn't seen them. My pulse was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I knew I had to do something. Spotting a wide shoulder up ahead, I made a snap decision. I slowed down as if I was about to stop, hoping they'd think I was complying. As soon as I saw their car brake, I slammed my foot on the gas. My car shot forward, and I veered back onto the highway. In the rearview mirror, I saw the Jeep hesitate for a moment before giving chase. My hands were trembling as I maneuvered through the lanes, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. The Jeep was fast, though, and it wasn't giving up easily. They stayed on my tail, their high beams blinding me as they got closer and closer. I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. My car wasn't built for high-speed chases, and the gas gauge was dipping dangerously low. Then I saw it, a sign for an upcoming exit. Without thinking twice, I swerved into the lane and took the off-ramp. The Jeep followed, but the narrow, winding road gave me an edge. I took random turns at every opportunity, hoping to confuse them. The area was rural, with few streetlights and no other cars in sight. I kept driving, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. After what felt like an eternity, the Jeep's headlights finally disappeared. I didn't slow down until I reached a small town. Pulling into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, I parked in a shadowy corner and turned off my engine. My whole body was shaking, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. I sat there for a while, watching the road to make sure they hadn't followed me. When I was confident they were gone, I pulled out my phone and searched for a nearby hotel. I didn't care if it cost double what I'd budgeted. I just needed somewhere safe to stay for the night. I checked into a small, rundown motel about 30 minutes later. The clerk gave me a strange look when I asked for a room as far from the main road as possible, but I didn't bother explaining. Once inside, I locked the door, slid the chain across, and pushed a chair up against the handle for good measure. Only then did I let myself collapse onto the bed. That night, I barely slept. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the distant hum of passing cars, set my nerves on edge. The next morning, I got up early and checked out without even showering. The rest of the drive to New York was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally reached my friend's place, I broke down and told them everything. They suggested I report it to the police, but what could I say? I didn't have a license plate number, and I hadn't gotten a good look at the men in the Jeep. To this day, I don't know who they were or what they wanted. Maybe it was just some sick prank, or maybe their intentions were far more sinister. When I was 18, I worked at a video rental store called Classic Reels in a small Midwestern town. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid decently and gave me something to do after school. My usual evening shift partner was Gwen, a girl I'd known since middle school. We weren't close friends back then, but working together brought us a lot closer. We had this routine: talk about school gossip, recommend movies to customers, and count down the hours until closing time. The store officially closed at 8 p.m. on weekdays, but sometimes, when it was particularly dead, we'd shut the place down a little early. Our boss wasn't the type to nitpick, as long as everything was locked up properly. One Thursday night, it was one of those slow evenings. By 7:30, we hadn't seen a customer in nearly an hour. "Let's just close up," Gwen said, leaning against the counter, spinning a pen between her fingers. I shrugged. "Why not? No one's coming in this late anyway." So, by 7:50, the lights were off, the register was closed, and we were heading out to the parking lot. It was one of those cold, crisp nights where you could see your breath in the air. We were halfway to our cars when I noticed a vehicle pulling into the lot. It was an old, beat-up sedan with its headlights cutting through the dark. Gwen and I stopped in our tracks as the car parked near the entrance. Two men got out. Both were wearing heavy coats and ski masks. It wasn't cold enough to justify ski masks, which immediately set off alarm bells. "Is that normal?" Gwen whispered, her voice shaky. "No," I said quietly, gripping my car keys a little tighter. The men walked up to the front door of the store and tried to pull it open. When it didn't budge, they jiggled it harder. One of them peered through the glass while the other paced nervously, glancing back at the parking lot. "We need to go," Gwen hissed, tugging at my arm. I nodded, and we quickly ducked into my car, keeping the headlights off. From the safety of the vehicle, we watched as the men lingered for another minute or two before returning to their car and driving off. "Do you think they were going to rob us?" Gwen asked as we sat there in silence, both of us still processing what had just happened. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I'm glad we weren't inside to find out." That night I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the image of those men in ski masks, wondering what might have happened if we hadn't closed early. A week later, I was back on the same evening shift with Gwen. By then, we had mostly brushed off the strange incident, chalking it up to paranoia. The week had been uneventful, and we figured it was just some weirdos who got the wrong idea about the store. It was another slow night, with only a handful of customers. At around 7:40, the parking lot was empty again, and we were debating whether to close early like before. "Should we wait it out this time?" Gwen asked, half joking. I smirked. "I don't think lightning strikes twice." At 7:55, just as we were starting to count the till, I heard the low rumble of an engine outside. I looked up, and my stomach dropped. It was the same car. "Gwen," I said, my voice trembling. She followed my gaze and froze. The sedan parked in the exact same spot as last time. Once again, two men stepped out, their faces obscured by ski masks. This time, we didn't hesitate. I ran to the door and flipped the lock, making sure it was secure. Gwen hit the light switches, plunging the store into darkness except for the faint glow of the neon "Open" sign in the window. We crouched behind the counter, barely daring to breathe. The men approached the door, and one of them immediately tried the handle. When it didn't open, he rattled it violently. Then came the banging. "Open the door!" one of them shouted, his voice muffled but angry. "We know you're in there!" I looked at Gwen, who was already pulling out her phone. She dialed 911, whispering into the receiver as quietly as she could. The banging got louder, more aggressive. One of the men started kicking the door. "I'm going to break this damn door down if you don't open it!" he yelled. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I grabbed the store's only weapon, a metal rod we used to adjust shelves, and clutched it tightly, though I doubted it would do much good. "They're on their way," Gwen whispered, her face pale. Minutes felt like hours as we waited. The men continued to shout and pound on the glass, but thankfully, the door held. Finally, we saw the flash of blue and red lights reflecting off the walls. "They're here," Gwen said, relief washing over her voice. The men must have seen the lights too because they bolted, running back to their car and speeding out of the lot just as the police arrived. The officers were kind but firm, asking us detailed questions about what had happened. They assured us they'd patrol the area and keep an eye out for the car, but without them actually breaking in, there wasn't much they could do at that moment. "It's a good thing you locked up when you did," one of the officers said. "People like that usually don't have good intentions." That was the understatement of the century. After the police left, Gwen and I sat in the back room, too shaken to finish closing up for the night. Eventually, we called our boss, who came in to finish the shift himself. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. What if we hadn't locked the door in time? What if the glass had shattered under their kicks? What if the police had been a minute too late?